I fundamentally disagree with the idea that developers choose the level of density that people live at. It's the other way around. People people decide what density wants they want to live at, and developers serve them. And the way that it works is
Oh, come
people
on.
decide.
Come on. Are you really saying people desperate to try and get any type of accommodation? We have an enormous housing crisis. People take what they get.
Right, but the reason that the land prices are high at Johnny Ronan's Docklands Tower is because and in that particular location.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 138 for the 7th of July 2022.
Hang on, William. Before you do your rant, we have to announce our summer special question and answer episode. How do people send in their questions?
That's right. We're going to have listeners asking questions, and me and maybe you as well answering the questions. People can email them in. You can email a question very simply to podcast@here'show.ie. You can send it in text, but it would be way better, because we're a podcast, if you could send in an audio file. You can send that into the same email address, podcast@here'show.ie. But much easier is just to send in a WhatsApp voice message. You can send that to 086 606 9401. And if you don't want to have to save that into your phone, we'll be putting a link on the website and also on the Twitter bio that you can just tap the link and it will automatically throw you up a WhatsApp message, a chat, so that you can send us a voice message.
Okay, and maybe a second question. What sort of questions do you want?
People can ask any question they want. We reserve the right to not answer inappropriate questions, but people know what the podcast is about. Anything vaguely in the wheelhouse of the podcast, people are more than welcome to ask questions. If you kind of want to make a statement or make a bit of a rant yourself, you're welcome to do that and maybe phrase it in the form of a question that we can react to. If you want to ask a factual question that you kind of want to find out about something, we'll try and answer that. I guess most people will be asking more opinionated questions or asking for our opinion. That's welcome as well.
All right, so now they know, so go ahead with your rant, William.
Thank you, Kevin. I spoke to a Sinn Féin supporter in the years after the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. I think it was during one of the interminable negotiations trying to get the DUP to participate and have the institutions up and running. And she said one thing about the peace deal that I thought was perceptive, if not very diplomatic. She said, the Unionists are too thick to realise that they've won, and the Shinners are too cute to admit that they lost. Mindsets may not have changed for some, at least, but I think that calculation may have changed in the years since. First off, there's peace. In that sense alone, everybody won. That can't be underestimated. But secondly, the Unionists may have won the war, if you want to call it that, but the Nationalists may yet win the peace. Personally, I don't think that we will have a border poll in the next couple of years. Politics isn't just aligned for that, even if you have Sinn Féin in power on both sides of the border, which is an open question in itself. But I think it's certain we'll have a border poll in the next couple of decades. The pattern of political and demographic movement in the north just makes that inevitable. One outside factor, underestimated in my view, that could impact this in an unpredictable way is Scottish independence. The SNP have announced their intention to have a referendum in October next year, along with a sophisticated legal strategy to defeat the London Conservative government's determination to prevent it. That's almost a no-lose strategy. If the Tories don't fold immediately, they just demonstrate ever more clearly the case for independence. If you're against Scottish independence, you might point to the opinion polls that show support for independence marginally behind 49 to 51, much less than the margin of error, but still behind. If you were for independence, you might point out that during the last referendum campaign in 2014, that's when support for independence really took off, going from about 25% to 45%, making the current 49% a good starting position. If you're against, you could say that well might be dry now with opinion polarised. And if you're for, you could say Boris Johnson. If Scottish independence comes off, and that's a very big if, that would effectively leave Northern Unionists with nothing to be united with. Scottish independence would most likely have a bigger impact on the lives of people in Derry and Dublin than it would on the lives of people in Dover and Derby. That is a very big if, and we should be aware of it, but we can't sit around waiting for it to happen. Possibly a more important thing to pay attention to is the mess over Roe v. Wade being overturned in the US. If you haven't kept up, Roe v. Wade was a constitutional ruling from the US Supreme Court 50 years ago. Prior to that, abortion was legal in only a few states. The Roe v. Wade decision set aside all those laws at the stroke of a pen and said that abortion was protected by the constitutional right to privacy, making it entirely legal in all 50 states, regardless of the state law. Last month, the now Conservative-dominated court said, no, it isn't protected, so all those old laws that haven't been repealed and a bunch of new ones kick in, making abortion entirely illegal or so restricted as to be impossible in huge swathes of the US. That's obviously the opposite direction of travel to what has happened in our own country, and that's meaningful, I think. In 2016, the Citizens' Assembly about abortion was set up by Enda Kenny to produce recommendations on the topic. It's clear what he was doing. He was kicking the issue into the long grass because he thought it was politically toxic, and it was a convenient way to do nothing about it for a few years and be able to fob off any questions. Sort of what Fianna Fáil did with corruption and tribunals. And it worked. Enda Kenny was out of office by the time the referendum came. The Citizens' Assembly, in case you don't know, gets 99 ordinary punters chosen at random to hear expert presentations on an issue, debate it themselves, and recommend a question that should be put to the wider electorate. Sounds good. Sounds democratic. Which is exactly what it was designed to do. To sound good in a government press release. To allow a minister to look into the camera and say that his government has taken action, and not to require them to actually do a thing. That was its purpose. The fact that it actually worked well was pure luck. Pure, dumb, blind luck. I'll give one small example of how it worked well. One of the issues that was floating around was to allow abortion only in the cases of rape and incest. That could sound like a good compromise. It's the sort of thing that would allow a minister to look into that camera and say, well, obviously we have to compromise, and I think that the government has struck a fair balance here. In a 2-minute interview, that's the sort of thing that governments can say and sound convincing. In fact, there are many countries who have laws just like this. But if you take time to sit down and think it through, you can see how stupid this idea would be. What threshold of proof would you use? Would a woman have to have made a complaint of rape to Gardaí? Clearly, it wouldn't be possible to wait until a verdict was handed down, but what if a not guilty verdict came later? Or what if the pregnancy, thought to be the result of rape, turned out later to be from consensual sex with the woman's partner? And would accused rapists in court be able to mount a defence of saying that the allegation was made only in order for the woman to access an abortion? Those issues, and dozens more that require thoughtful input, were sorted through by the Citizens' Assembly. And the result was that a coherent and reasoned proposal was put to the people, and it informed public debate. The fact that citizens' assemblies seem to have been a very good idea is not down to far-sighted statesmanship. It was purely a political stroke to take an issue off the agenda for a couple of years. But it worked, so let's not knock it. Lots of good ideas came from dumb luck. Someone was trying to do one thing, and they hit on an idea that worked for something else. Viagra was developed as a drug for heart disease. Microwave ovens were developed by people reheating frozen hamsters and trying to bring them back to life. Seriously, that's true. I think that part of the culture war in the US about abortion can be blamed on the fact that there was no public debate and pretty much no democratic input into introducing abortion in the first place. Its proponents essentially got a shortcut around Congress by getting the Supreme Court to rule that it was included in the itself presumed right to privacy. I'm not a legal scholar, so I won't comment on that, but if there had been public debate and more democratic legitimacy behind that decision, I think they wouldn't be where they are now. So back to the border poll. In the old days, the North was the ultimate zero-sum game. Anything that was good for them'uns was bad for us'uns. But the result of the Assembly elections is clear. That's just not true anymore. In particular, the Alliance Party vote seems to make it clear that there is a big swathe of vote from the unionist community, probably young, middle class and liberal, who just don't care about unionism. It's not on their agenda. That's not to say that they aren't interested at all. It's just not the most dominant issue for them in the way that it was for basically everyone in the North for the last century. As I say, I think most of this demographic comes from a unionist background, but I'm sure there are some nationalists in there too. And this demographic is growing rapidly. The bottom line is that this is the demographic that will swing the border poll. As I said, I think the border poll is coming, but not coming very soon, although there is a possibility it could be on us before we expect it, because events, dear boy, events. The worst possible thing that could happen would be to have a Brexit-style poll, with people voting having no clear understanding of what they're voting for, leaving one or even both sides aggrieved when the effects don't match what they expected on polling day. Political reality right now is that unionists simply won't discuss a united Ireland. They're doing the political equivalent of sticking their fingers in their ears and singing "La La, I'm not listening." But they aren't the only show in town. There's now a large middle ground in the North, and when it comes to the border poll, the side that wins will be the side that listens best to and takes into account best the concerns of that middle ground. Political legitimacy is important. That will also vastly improve the sort of country that we all live in for decades, maybe centuries into the future. It's time to start listening. In a moment, we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially Owen Payne, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. We're not nearly in the same league as some other Irish podcasters I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there are people out there who are listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media, and you're more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as Owen Payne and the other donors and throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Sean Keyes is the finance correspondent for The Currency. That's a subscription news website, mostly financial news, I think, Sean. And a while back, you did a Twitter thread that caught my eye that essentially says that we shouldn't be worrying about land prices. Am I getting that right? Or do you want to, rather than me mangling your argument, do you want to make it yourself?
Sure. Hi, William. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I wanted to do that because it's just something that is just it's a very big part of the sort of discourse around housing in Ireland, and I observed that discourse quite closely on Twitter. I'm kind of get stuck in all these rows myself, and I I know what people are, how they think about these things and how they talk about these things and how they argue about them. And anyway, an idea that comes up all the time is land prices. And it's an idea that like the debate on Twitter is broadly between kind of property developer types and their allies, what do you call it, fellow travelers, the economists, and I'm probably in that category. And then there's on the other side would be I guess planners and architects and people coming from that perspective. So they've kind of the two groups are they're in each side of the grate, and they've got the debate, and they've got a very different perspective on things. And this idea of land prices comes up a lot, particularly from the planner side. And I think that the planners, for the planners, land prices are a very big problem and a very big kind of constraint because planners, I would say, I think it's fair to say they try to kind of put a shape on the city.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of how they see their job.
And this, by the city, we mean Dublin mostly, but this has impact right around the country.
Yeah, I guess it's there. It's at its most at its most relevant in Dublin, where land prices are highest and the density is highest,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when the conflict is at its most acute. But it applies everywhere. But anyway, so the planners try to put a shape on the city, and they have their own sort of ideas of what works best, and so they try to put those ideas into practice with zoning rules and with sort of guidelines and implementation and all that sort of stuff. And they try to build a city that they think works well in accordance with good design principles, which is legit. But so for those guys, so let's say they have an idea that a really nice urban form is the kind that you find in the city of Utrecht in Holland, or Freiburg in Germany, or Copenhagen or something. And that form might be a 7-story building around a courtyard where with some retail and cultural stuff, and those nice European cities that we're all familiar with. And so they might say, okay, we'd like that. We're going to zone something that kind of looks like that. And then in real life, they try to do it, and they run into this problem that the land price is really high. And that blows up the whole economics of this project, of this idea. Because it's like they had an idea that maybe they have a 6-story building and a scheme that would have 100 people per hectare, but the land cost is so high that it makes it impossible to deliver at that density. So for that reason, and for that sort of pattern repeats itself at all these different scales. At as I said, maybe these 6-story Freiburg side of things, or in suburbs, whatever. This pattern of the planners trying to implement their plan in reality and then running up against the kind of immovable object of high land prices and that blowing up their plans. So for that reason, the planners, I think, are fixated on land prices and on how to solve the problem of high land prices, how to get land prices down so that they can basically enact their plans. If land prices were lower, then they would be able to do their Freiburgs and whatever else plans they might have. So I think that, I mean, I'm trying to not be, I'm on the other side of the fence to them. I'm trying to be fair to them. That's sort of how they see it. And I come from a totally different perspective. And I think that actually high land prices are good. And the reason that I think high land prices are good, like what are high land prices? Like that means the land is in high demand. It means a lot of people want to live there. Why do people want to live in a place? Well, usually it's because there's loads of jobs around. So that workers can have a big choice of different employers. They can have short commutes to their jobs. It also there's also probably lots of amenities around, lots of restaurants and things like that.
Hmm.
So all these factors tend to make a place valuable or sorry, desirable, which increases the demand for the land and increases the land price. And yeah, so I think that's good because like that's essentially that process of people being attracted together and wanting to live close by each other in one small area is basically what we're talking about is a process of urbanization, right? That's how villages came to have 2 stories and towns came to have 4 stories and the docklands of Dublin came to have 20 stories. It's the same idea of people wanting to be close by each other. And so I think high land prices are in themselves good because they are a sign that you've got a place that's attractive and it's got all these good qualities.
Pause with that idea for a second.
Okay,
When
yeah,
you say
go
when
ahead.
you say high land prices are good, do you mean that high land prices produce a good effect, or they are a symptom of something good happening? Because those are two different things. Are they the cause, or are they the effect?
Yeah, they're the effect. The
Okay.
thing that's good, the thing that's good is people coming together
Yeah.
and living close by each other. And to get even more kind of up in the clouds with it, when people coming together is like, the foundation of productivity. And like when people gather
Hmm.
together in cities, they start swapping ideas and coming up with new things to try out and starting
So, so,
companies.
so,
And
so, so
yeah,
basically, if we were to put you up against John B. Keane character and the field, you'd be the diametrically opposed opinion to that, in that you don't want everyone to live in one bungalow on a 1 acre plot that's half a mile from the next house, and you get this incredibly thin development that some politicians in this country seem to think is a desirable outcome. And what you're saying is perhaps more urbane, more continental, a more modern way of thinking, but it's entirely defensible. And of course, humanity, the very existence of humanity, was us changing from being roaming animals in the Serengeti to coming together in villages and, as you say, exchanging ideas and so forth. And really what I'm wondering is whether you're saying that planners, for example, in the local authorities, are deliberately soft pedaling or not promoting developments that would have the result of increasing the value of sites, because obviously something built more densely is going to return more value in human terms and therefore be more financially valuable. Are you saying that there is an effect that's actually having a real policy that is happening, that people who can make a difference are residential buildings at a lower density, simply just to push down the figure of the price of land?
well, like first thing is yes, it is definitely happening that our planning system is reducing the density of and reducing how intensely we use land. That's undeniable. I mean, Dublin is well, it's not one of the least densities in Europe,
Yes, it
but it's
is.
pretty, yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no,
There's
it
different,
actually
people
is. You
debate
can
it, people
measure.
do.
Yeah, Dublin, I mean, it depends on how you cut it and where you make the borders, but Dublin isn't an awful lot smaller in terms of footprint than Paris with 20 million people.
Yeah, Dublin's is not very dense. I think it's inarguable. Anyway, so that's not because of geology. It's not because Dublin is a poor city which which can't afford to, put people together in
Build up
tall
or whatever.
buildings or yeah, it's because of the planning system. Now, you said the second part of your question was, are they doing it specifically to drive down the cost of land? I don't think that at a high level when they're coming up with their plans, I don't think they think about it exactly in those terms. We're going to limit density in order to keep control land. But I think that's sort of a side effect of what they do, and it sort of comes up all the time when you talk about liberalizing the system, reforming the system, allowing upzoning. That's sort of an argument that does get made. And just to complete, I was kind of doing a big meandering nonsense there earlier on. So just to finish my thought, so I think high land prices are a sign of that something good is happening. So to me, the sensible way of treating that, of dealing with the fact that a lot of people want to live in the center of the city where they've got short commutes and where there's lots of amenities, is is to allow them to live in high densities in those locations, so that yes, the land price will be high, but the way you solve that problem is you spread that land cost over a large number of units, and that's where density comes from. And that's why you have, as I said, 4-story buildings at O'Connell Street in Limerick, 2-story buildings in Abbey Field in County Limerick, and 30-story buildings in the Docklands. It's like all of these are just like a rational response to higher land prices, and the way you deal with that is by spreading the units out across over a large number of people. And the problem comes when if you're a planner and you introduce an artificial ceiling on the density that you think should be allowed for your own planning reasons, then you're into trouble. All of a sudden, because the density that people actually want to live at is higher than the density that you are allowing them to live at, all of a sudden the land is too high per unit and we can't make the numbers work, and land prices are too high.
Okay, and that's you've come around. Thank you very much to finish that thought. Maybe I shouldn't have interrupted you there, but I just wanted to clarify previously. And you say the density that people want to live at. There is more than one opinion on that. And for example, the density that people want to live at as viewed by developers who are trying to extract the absolute maximum value from their, from the site that they may have paid several million from, might be different to the density that the actual individuals who move into that development want to live at, and is definitely different to the density that people who already live in the surroundings, probably at a much lower density, want to have built near them. And we've seen a lot of planning objections in the not so distant past of people literally making an objection to developments in, very close to the centre of Dublin, saying, we don't want the sort of person who lives in an apartment living near us. We want people who live in houses with a front door and a back door living with us.
Well,
go ahead.
Sorry, you broke up in the last 2 seconds, but I think I did get your question. I fundamentally disagree with the idea that developers choose the level of density that people live at. It's the other way around. People decide what density they want to live at, and developers serve them. And the way that it works is
come on! Are you really saying people desperate to try and get any type of accommodation with an enormous housing crisis? People take what they get.
Right, but the reason that the land prices are high at Johnny Ronan's Docklands Tower isn't because, and in that particular location, rather than in Santry, is because loads and loads of people do want to live there.
Yes.
That's
the aggregate. Yes, you're correct in that. That's the aggregate decision of lots of people wanting to live there, meaning that the density would be high. Although the individuals, and this is, I think, an important thing to understand, any one individual person might not want to, if they could live at that location with low density, they might choose that.
Well, an individual can do what they want, but I mean, Johnny Ronan doesn't get to decide, okay, I'm going to build a 10-story tower in Santry or a 30-story tower in Santry, and because I'm the powerful developer, that's where you the people must live. If he did that, he'd be bankrupt, right? Because there wouldn't be demand for it in Santry. There is demand for it in the Docklands. So it's the land prices are the signal that goes from that transfers from the ordinary people's desires about where they want to live, and how it gets to the developer, and the developer realizes, okay, all these people are telling me they want to live in this place. I'm going to take that, use that signal. I'm going to build something tall, and then if they're a good developer, the thing will fill up, and then it'll be successful. People will have homes.
Oh, okay. And I think that word is great, a signal. And I think you're absolutely right. In some cases, land prices are a signal that a lot of people want to be there. And that's also the same with housing prices. But I think that land prices can be other things as well. And in particular, in Ireland, we have, and this is just talking about agricultural land, we have wildly increased values. And to put this in context, and these figures are going back a little bit to Celtic Tiger times, prices went down after that, they've gone pretty much back up again since, so I don't think these are too wrong. Irish land, agricultural land, like for like, costs 4 times what agricultural land in Britain costs, and it costs 10 times what agricultural land in France costs. Now, okay, Britain has left the EU, France has not, so French and Irish farmers are producing goods that they're selling into the same single agricultural market, food market in the EU. But for some reason, Irish agricultural land is 10 times, is changing hands at 10 times the value of French agricultural land. And I would say that the reason for that is because the speculative value of the likelihood of that being rezoned for housing is being priced into the agricultural market land. And you can see that's kind of the proof of that when, for example, you see that in rocky Wicklow, agricultural land is vastly more expensive than it is in boggy Leitrim. The quality of the land from an agricultural point of view is pretty much the same, but Wicklow is near Dublin, therefore Wicklow land, but still agricultural land is much more expensive because whoever's buying it has half a hope that it will be rezoned for housing. And if you look at the areas for housing in Dublin, it's more than 20 years since Tom McEnany, then a business and finance journalist, wrote a piece, and he pointed out that pretty much all of the available housing land around Dublin was controlled by about 8 developers / speculators / land hoarders. I don't particularly want to use pejorative language, but people who were sitting on vast amounts of land. When it is controlled by such a small amount of people, they can charge what they like.
Well, like I'm not sure that I accept that the land supply in Ireland or even in Dublin is controlled by a cartel that is operating. I guess the implication is that they're operating like a cartel and maximizing their returns by selling it down slowly. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, they don't, and we need to be careful about what we accuse anybody of, but they don't even need to operate like a cartel, because if they own on average about 10% of all of the available housing land each, any one of them selling up a chunk of their stock would devalue the remainder of their stock so much that they'd be losing money. So the land is owned by such a small number of people and controlled by such a small number of people that there is no need for them to operate in a cartel fashion.
I mean, it gets thrown around, the speculation thing. It's difficult to prove. I don't find it very convincing for a couple of reasons. One, I suppose, is like, good businesses are judged by their return on capital, not just their profits, but like their profits as a percentage of all the assets that they have and the capital that's tied up in the company. So like sitting around on land for years and years in the expectation that it'll go up is not a very capital efficient way to run a business. And I know like
it's not a business. Speculation is not a business. And it is a way to store wealth. And if the price of the land that you're sitting on is increasing at a rate that's higher than the bank interest rate, then you'd be crazy to sell up and put the money in the bank because you'd be making a lower return.
Well, bank companies don't judge themselves that way. Like, I suppose companies tend to be funded by equity, right?
No, but these are all private individuals, and they one of the remarkable features of them is that they're not amenable to like disclosures that they would have to give if they were limited companies or whatever. It's all essentially private individuals. I'm sure it's run through privately held companies, but it's essentially a single person, or perhaps in one case a pair of brothers, who are making the decisions without any responsibility to shareholders.
Okay, I mean, these are a group of people that are, it's alleged, are sort of drip feeding land into Dublin in order to kind of artificially inflate land costs. So that's the agricultural land. Like, what about all the existing zone land in Dublin? What about all the land in the rest of the country which follow the same pattern? I mean, there isn't a cartel controlling land prices around all of our major cities yet. They have the same issues going on.
That's true. I would argue that one of the main problems, there are an awful lot of little cartels, or people, very small people essentially sitting on land that is quite unproductive. But I would argue that the essential problem in Ireland is that the totality of our tax base is essentially on economic activity, either on income tax or on VAT sales tax or on company profits or whatever. We have essentially no tax on property. If you or I were sitting in some places, particularly densely populated places in the US, you could expect to be paying more in property taxes than you would be paying in income tax every year.
Yeah, yeah.
And
No, I
that's
completely
perhaps
agree on
extreme.
that.
But
Yeah,
the fact that somebody who has a huge amount of wealth, possibly inherited, and in some cases inherited entirely tax-free, can pay no tax at all and can live by borrowing against that, pay no tax at all, and enjoy all of the benefits of society, whereby people who are working hard to make a only relatively decent living pay all of the taxes. That's obviously unfair, and not only is it unfair, it has the effect of skewing our economy. Everybody knows that if you put high taxes on cigarettes, less people smoke. If we put high taxes on work and economic activity, and as we do, basically no taxes on holding onto wealth and doing nothing with it in property, then it's not surprising that we have a culture that is all centered around house prices, and we have TV shows about house prices, and you have, depending on the circles you mix in, it's almost impossible to have a drink with anybody without them talking about house prices. That's, in my view, the thing that needs to shift, and that would push land prices down, unquestionably. But the real thing where, and I think you got it right a lot in what you said in Twitter, but I think you weren't correct to identify, that price signal as anything other than a speedometer. If you broke the glass in your car and pushed the needle on the speedometer down, that wouldn't slow down your car. You have to hit the brakes to slow the car. It's purely an effect. Isn't that correct?
So I think I am saying it's an effect, though, aren't I? I'm saying that the thing that's good is is that you've got really productive places with loads of employment and loads of workers and loads of amenities around, and that's the thing. And then the land prices are just sort of an effect of people being attracted to that place. So that's what I've been saying. I don't fully understand.
That's true. I am saying
Yeah.
that is one part of the signal that's coming out in land prices, but another part is that we have a huge amount of congestion in the property market, and people are storing wealth in property. Both large-scale property holders and also people at a very small scale are seeing it as a store of wealth, not a house to live in. And that gives it speculative value, which is having unbelievable effects socially, that you have people effectively living at home. We even call it that, living at home with their parents well into their 30s, putting off getting married, certainly putting off having children, because we're doing this crazy thing of protecting propertied wealth from all taxes.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree on that. And it's one of these ones, it's sort of disheartening. It's in the same way as with climate change. Like the economists figured out about 30 years ago or longer that, like, oh yeah, if you just impose a carbon tax, that would be a perfectly efficient way to solve climate change. We'll just do that. But like, yet no, there's no significant carbon taxes, or they're quite small. And it's one of these things that, even despite being quite an efficient and well thought through solution, property taxes, and especially land value taxes, are incredibly politically unpopular because you piss off a lot of people when you impose them.
Yeah.
Ireland is a country. I think I'm not sure if it's unique in Europe, but it's very much on its own in Europe in having very little property tax.
Yeah.
I think there's all these good reasons for it. I mean, another reason, it's a tax, like, unlike labor or capital, it's a tax that can't be sort of avoided.
Yes.
If you tax land, there's nothing else. There's nothing that you can do except pay it. It doesn't distort your behavior in any way, so it's very efficient that way. And then, like, I think the single best argument for a land value tax, given the situation we face now, is it penalizes inefficient use of land. So all of these, whether they're your I don't know, alleged land hoarders at the outskirts of Dublin City, or people sitting in big gardens,
or 180,000 vacant dwellings in the country.
Vacant dwellings in city centres, big gardens in Fox Rock, brownfield sites in the Docklands, all these inefficient golf courses, greyhound tracks, all these inefficient uses of land. Like, you don't get to waste good land when there's a land value tax. But it's all notional because it's never going to happen. Even the parties, we've got 4 or 5 left-wing parties in Ireland.
Hmm.
Not even our left-wing parties have the stomach to ask for one, so we might as well talk about anything, really.
I guess that's possibly because one of their prominent TDs is strikingly a TD for Dunleary, one of the highest property value areas in the country. But what I essentially want to maybe just finally explore with you is the price of housing in Ireland has an enormous negative social effect, quite apart from the fact that it costs people a lot of money. The social effects are really, really negative. But there's a huge amount of muddled thinking, and no more than 1 or 2 clicks from your Twitter thread that we were talking about, you will find people saying, I pay X amount per month rent, but the bank won't give me a mortgage that would have the same repayments, and people essentially saying the bank should loosen up credit so that I could get more money and be able to buy a house with the amount of money that I could borrow. There's just an enormous amount of people who are essentially saying, put more cash, pump more money into the property market so that I can buy a house, without thinking the next step. If you're doing that for that person, you're doing it for everybody else, and you're inflating the prices, and there's not one extra person housed. Why are we so bad at thinking about this?
Oh, it's I don't know. I think maybe my big theory of Ireland is that like the amount of change that our country has gone through in 40 years is like unnatural
Mm-hmm.
for an ordinary democracy. In terms of like social change in the 90s, and then basically like social change, population change, wealth, like cultural conscious being introduced. Like, sorry, not that I'm against that, but anyway, my point is like the population has more than doubled since the 90s. Our wealth has gone from being one of the poorest in Europe to one of the richest. And I think all the institutions that we had, which worked okay for 70 years when the country was just sort of gradually shrinking and wasting away, they are having to kind of totally reimagine themselves, reform themselves. And it's just really hard to like on the fly come up with like as a democracy, oh, okay, you know, we've got to house these 50,000 people per year. We've got to build an extra 50%, 100% more houses in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Like getting good solutions to those problems takes decades. Places like the Netherlands, places like Austria, places like Germany, they've been grappling with these problems for a long time, and we've had to try to solve everything all at once, and it's taking time to work things through.
Uh-huh.
That's my big theory.
And we have politicians who say make things like first-time buyer grants to literally pump more money into the market without a single extra house. Are you confident that this is all fools and no knaves, that there's not people there who are fully aware that they are enriching their friends when they do this?
I'm sure like there's a lot of politicians are, you know, like everywhere in the world, like politicians are responding to their own incentives and kind of doing things that will get them reelected. Like I try not to get too disappointed when that happens, even though, you know, sometimes it results in bad policy, because like that's just democracy, and the hope isn't that they get the policy right every time. It's more that you trust that the signals they're getting from their voters will, over the long run, result in sort of some good answers, even if along the way they make some bad turns, like, you know, stuff you're talking about, HAP policy or first-time buyer subsidies, things like that. I try to be optimistic and think of them as just sort of the noise, where there's a real signal underneath that, and over the course of decades that we'll figure out something that actually works.
It seems to take quite a lot of decades. Sean Keyes, finance correspondent at The Currency, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much for having me.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Sean Keyes at Keyes, Keyes. And get in touch if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Thanks again to Owen Payne and all the other patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get anything like some other Irish podcasters that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting. We basically do the podcast for free, but if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the price of a pint of beer, or even just the price of a litre of milk once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also, there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. And don't forget, we want your questions for the summer special question and answer podcast. You can email them to podcast@here'show.ie in audio or text format, or even easier, send a WhatsApp voice message to 086 606 9401, and there's a link that you can tap on the website and on the Twitter page to directly send a WhatsApp message. You don't even have to save the number. We'd love to hear from you. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.